60 years ago, a high school teacher in the town of Decatur, Illinois, vanished without a trace right in her own home, leaving the lights on, a half-eaten meal, and a husband who claimed she just went on a short vacation. The police found no body, no signs of violence, and the case was quickly closed as a voluntary disappearance. However, through all those years in the Macon County archives, a dusty file folder remained, along with a police officer's note: "If anyone finds her, start with this bill." Then one day, while digging foundations for construction on the very same plot of land as the old Whitfield house, a group of workers discovered something buried deep underground, a detail that reopened the entire case, presumed long forgotten, and shocked the entire state of Illinois in a way no one could have imagined. Before diving into this chilling story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love true crime stories told from an investigative perspective, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. July 1945. Decatur, Illinois, a small industrial town on the banks of the Sangamon River, had just gone through a jubilant victory week. After years of war, the people of Decatur seemed to be breathing a new peace, but just a few streets from downtown, in the gray house at 47 North Jasper Street, something had slipped out of its familiar orbit. Eleanor Whitfield, 31 years old, a literature teacher at Decatur High School, was a woman everyone loved, gentle, reserved, often seen walking every afternoon with her two small dogs, Daisy and Scout. Her husband, Ray Whitfield, 38 years old, a recently discharged veteran, now working as a farm machinery repairman. They lived in the house left to Eleanor by her parents, a two-story wooden home with a white picket fence and a garden full of peonies. Neighbors said the couple kept to themselves, but every evening, the warm glow of light spilled from the living room windows until late at night. On Friday evening, July 20th, around 8:30, Mrs. Martha Kane, the owner of a nearby hair salon, saw Eleanor walking the two dogs along the sidewalk, wearing a floral dress and her familiar embroidered EW handkerchief tied at her wrist. Eleanor smiled and greeted her, her voice light as the breeze. "Good Friday evening, Martha." That was the last time anyone saw her. Around 9 o'clock, many in the neighborhood heard arguing voices coming from the Whitfield house, a woman's voice choked with tears, then a man's voice growling word by word. A door slammed hard, something fell, then silence. After that came the prolonged barking of dogs. Near 11 o'clock, Mr. McCallan, who lived at the end of the street, saw headlights sweep across the wooden fence, then a small brown pickup truck, the one everyone in the area knew was Ray Whitfield's, leave the house, speeding off toward the dirt road leading down to the riverbank. The lights in the house stayed on, the windows tightly shut. The next morning, sunlight shone down on the cobblestone street, everything looking normal, except for the two dogs in the Whitfield yard barking themselves hoarse. The living room lights were still on, the curtains undrawn, and Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. All morning, no one came or went. Mrs. Kane knocked on the door, no answer. By noon, Ray appeared on the porch, speaking through the door. "Eleanor's gone to visit relatives in Missouri. She needs a few weeks' rest." Those words sounded out of place in the summer swelter. 2 days passed. The lights stayed on all night, the dogs howling long in the silence. No one saw Eleanor return, nor was there any phone call or letter sent. On the evening of the 22nd, Mrs. Kane reported it to the police, saying something was wrong. The next morning, July 23rd, Ray Whitfield walked into the Decatur police station, his face tired, but his voice even and dry as paper. "My wife is missing." The desk officer looked at him over the wooden counter, scribbling a few lines in the report book. "Missing person report. Eleanor Whitfield, female, age 31, last seen July 20th, 1945. That very afternoon, as Eleanor's missing person report was entered into the log, Decatur began sinking back into the muggy air of a fading summer day. For 3 days, the house at 47 North Jasper had stayed lit every night, the dogs barking themselves hoarse, and no one had seen that woman's shadow again. The story spread gradually through the neighborhood, and by early the next morning, Sheriff Robert Henson and 2 of his deputies were dispatched to the scene. Henson was a man around 50, tough, more accustomed to petty thefts or bar fights than disappearances. He arrived at the Whitfield house just before 8 in the morning. The early sunlight glinted off the weathered white fence. The peonies in the garden wilted, the soil cracked and barren. The 2 small dogs were still confined to the backyard, howling non-stop. From the street, the house looked eerily still, as if time had stopped since the night Eleanor vanished. Ray Whitfield came to the door when he heard the knock. He was wearing a rumpled shirt, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes, his face impassive. When Henson stated his purpose, Ray said curtly, "I already told you, she's in Missouri, visiting relatives. I don't know when she'll be back." That calm tone sent a chill through Henson. No one reported a missing wife after 3 days with such indifference. The front door was locked from the outside, and Henson requested to enter and check. Ray hesitated for a moment, then pulled out the key, saying, "Go ahead and look, you won't find anything." The door swung open, and a stifling wave of air, mixed with the smell of spoiled food and machine oil, rushed out. The house was pitch dark, despite the bright daylight outside. The living room lights were still on, the curtains drawn tight. The dining table was set with 2 half-eaten plates of food, cloudy glasses half full of water. Next to the stove, a pot of soup left too long had congealed with a layer of fat. The living room was unnaturally tidy, the armchair straight, the bookshelves dust-free, the curtains fully draped, as if someone had arranged everything too carefully. On the wall, the clock had stopped at 9:15. Henson noted quickly, clock stopped right in the time frame neighbors heard the argument. In the bedroom, Eleanor's clothes and jewelry were all intact, the bed neatly made. A woman leaving home for 3 days without taking clothes, a purse, or her wedding ring. That couldn't be going on vacation. Henson turned and asked, "Are you sure she went to Missouri?" "She said so. I didn't stop her." "How did she go?" "I think by train. Maybe from Springfield." "Did she take luggage?" Ray was silent for a few seconds, then replied, "I don't remember." The 2 deputies quietly checked around. One called out, "Boss, look at this." On an upholstered chair near the window, they found an embroidered EW handkerchief, the edge stained with a dried brown streak, darkened like blood. Henson leaned down to examine it, frowning, using tweezers to pick it up and seal it in a paper bag. He asked, "Your wife's?" Ray glanced at it, nodded, his voice hoarse. "She always carried it." After documenting the scene, Henson stepped out onto the porch. The sunlight poured down on the barren garden. He noticed fresh digging marks in the soil behind the house near the shed. The dirt color different from the rest, as if someone had just dug and hastily covered it up. He was about to ask, but Ray spoke first. "I was repairing the shed floor. You must have seen the extra dirt." The answer was curt, emotionless. The sheriff stood still, his eyes fixed on the patch of ground out back. His intuition began to prickle. The kind of intuition from someone accustomed to reading the truth through what others wanted to hide. He instructed his 2 subordinates, "Document the entire scene, take photos, seal the house. No one enters without a warrant." Leaving North Jasper Street, Henson sat in the car, flipping through his notebook. He wrote the first line for the new case. Case number 1945-217, Missing Person Report. Subject, Eleanor Whitfield, 31 years old. Husband claims she traveled to Missouri. No forced entry, no struggle. Handkerchief with brown stain recovered from living room. He set down the pen, closed the notebook, and looked out the window. In the distance, the Whitfield house was small and gray in the midday sun, the tree shadows stretching like long black streaks across the ground. In the quiet space, Henson thought of only one thing. A woman doesn't leave her life this neatly on her own. 2 days after the initial report, Sheriff Robert Henson began collecting witness statements around the North Jasper neighborhood. The Whitfield house remained sealed. A "Do not enter" Macon County Sheriff's Office sign posted on the front door. In those early days of the investigation, Henson knew that every smallest detail, a sound, a light, or an engine noise, could determine the case's direction. And it seemed someone had heard more than Ray Whitfield wanted people to believe. The first people he met were Mr. and Mrs. McAllen, the couple living right at the head of the street. Mr. McAllen, a retired mechanic, said that on Friday evening he was sitting smoking on the porch when he heard shouting coming from the house at 47. A woman's voice, he said, sounded like she was crying or begging someone. Then I heard a man's voice yelling loudly. After that, a loud thud, like someone threw something heavy on the floor. He paused, took a drag, his voice slow. Around 11, minus a bit, I saw headlights sweep across the fence. Whitfield's small brown pickup drove toward the riverbank. I thought he was out on business, didn't expect the house lights to still be on the next morning. His wife, Mrs. McAllen, added, the next morning I heard the dogs barking all day. I went over and knocked to check, but no one answered. The lights were on day and night. I thought it was strange. Henson noted carefully, asking them to sign confirmation. As he left the porch, he looked down the street to where the Whitfield house stood silently, and caught the faint lingering smell of gasoline in the air. The second person Henson sought out was Martha Kane, the hair salon owner, who had first reported to the police. She greeted him in the shop, the air thick with perm solution and talcum powder. Martha said, she was my regular customer for 3 years, came every month, right on time, right on schedule. She was neat, thoughtful. That Saturday she had an appointment with me at 8 in the morning, but she didn't show. I called, no one picked up. I knew something was wrong. She paused, her voice dropping. Lately, Eleanor often mentioned Ray getting angry easily, especially after he lost his job at the factory. She said sometimes she was scared to be home alone with him. I asked why she didn't leave. She smiled and said, I'll probably go soon enough. Henson looked at her for a moment, then nodded, adding a line to his notebook. Witness confirms victim intended to leave husband. High possibility of domestic conflict. Before leaving the shop, Martha added, if you want to know, I don't believe she left. Eleanor would never leave her 2 dogs behind, or let the house get that messy. She loved order more than anyone I knew. That afternoon, Henson returned to the station and summoned Ray Whitfield for a second interview. He arrived wearing a fresh white shirt, hair combed back, looking more composed than before. Henson sat behind the desk, his voice steady. Let's talk a bit more, Mr. Whitfield. A few witnesses heard arguing on Friday evening. Can you explain? Ray shrugged. We were just arguing about money. Nothing serious. Witnesses also saw your truck leaving the house around 11 at night. I went out for a drive to clear my head. I was upset. Did your wife go with you? Ray looked down at his hands. No, she told me to go. She needed quiet. Henson flipped through the previous report, continuing, you said she went to Missouri, but that evening she was still at home. Right? Ray was silent. A few seconds later he replied, oh, right. But the next morning, she said she'd go visit an old friend in Springfield. I didn't hold her back. Henson tilted his head slightly. Which friend? I don't know exactly. An old classmate, I think named Ruth or Ruby or something. How did she go? Train. From which station? Probably Springfield. The sheriff set down the pen, looking straight at Ray. He said slowly, do you know Springfield is over 50 miles away? And there was no overnight train to Missouri that night? Ray stiffened, then gave a faint smile. Maybe I got it wrong. After Ray left the room, Henson sat alone with the stack of papers. He compared the statements, the time of disappearance, the truck leaving the house, the Missouri trip story, the old classmate in Springfield, all contradictory. Eleanor vanished around after 9 in the evening, but according to her husband, she left the next morning. The gap between those 2 points, 7 o'clock at night, and the next morning, was the silence he needed to fill. Henson opened the file, writing the second note. Husband's statement contradictory. Witnesses confirm argument 9 o'clock. 9:15 p.m. Truck left house, 11 p.m. No evidence victim left town by public transport. Then he closed the notebook, looking out the office window. Outside, the sunset bled red like blood across the Illinois sky. In his mind, the question repeated, how did Eleanor Whitfield leave the house, and who drove that truck? That evening, after reviewing all the scene photos, Henson wrote the final line for that day's report. Macon County Case #1945217. Suspicious disappearance, probable foul play. The words were stark and cold, but Henson knew that from this moment, it was no longer just a disappearance. It was the beginning of a murder case. 2 days after the second interview, as the contradictions in Ray Whitfield's statements grew clearer, Sheriff Robert Henson decided to return to the house at 47 North Jasper for a more thorough search. He didn't want to believe that the gentle young woman had simply gone to Missouri as her husband said. Every detail said the opposite. The house showed no signs of departure, the clothes were intact, and her Ford Deluxe was still parked in the garage. That morning, the sky was overcast gray. Henson and Deputy Paul Ridley brought a 35mm camera and several evidence bags. When they arrived, the backyard wooden gate was still ajar, the air thick with damp soil and machine oil. Henson went straight to the shed out back, a small wooden structure with a rusted tin roof, just 20 meters from the main house. When he opened the door, the sharp smell of lime and gasoline hit him full in the face. Right in the middle of the floor, an open bag of lime leaned against the wall, white powder scattered in patches across the base. Next to it was a tightly rolled tarpaulin, the edges soiled, still damp and gritty with sand. An iron shovel leaned in the corner, the blade caked with wet dirt and chunks of not quite dry cement. Henson bent down, touching the handle. It was still slightly warm in the early sun, as if someone had used it not long before. Ray said he was repairing the shed floor, Ridley said quietly. But Henson didn't respond. He knelt, examining the floor. A section of cement in the corner wall was a completely different color from the rest, lighter, smoother, and not fully dry. When he tapped it lightly with the knife tip, the sound was different, dull, heavy, like something hollow underneath. He pried at the thin cement layer with the knife, revealing damp soil below, a pungent smell rising up. Poured within the last few days, Henson determined. The two circled the shed. On the wooden shelves, cans of paint, a kerosene drum, a gasoline can, and a lantern not quite extinguished. In the dim light, they spotted faint small tire marks, possibly from a handcart or barrel roller, imprinted on the old cement floor. The marks led to the back door, then vanished into the dirt yard. Henson went outside, following the tire tracks. Behind the shed, a roughly 2-square-meter patch of ground had been dug up and refilled. The soil was darker than the surrounding area, and there were a few white gravel bits, signs of spilled cement. He stopped, hands on his hips. If this is where he buried something, this guy knows how to cover it up. Ridley looked around, tense. "Boss, want me to dig a test?" Henson shook his head. "Not yet, we need a warrant." They moved to the garage. Eleanor's brown Ford Deluxe sat motionless, a thin layer of dust on the hood. Henson opened the door, the smell of gasoline and old paper mixed. On the passenger seat was Eleanor's light coat, her handbag, and house keys. He tried the ignition. The tank was full. The engine started on the first turn. That meant she hadn't used the car to go anywhere. "A woman going to Missouri and leaving her purse and car behind," Henson said quietly, his eyes hardening. Ray appeared at the door, hands in his pockets, voice calm. "I told you, she took the train. The car stayed because she doesn't drive long distances." Henson stepped closer. "Do you know your wife didn't buy any train tickets in Springfield or Decatur in the last 3 days?" Ray looked at him, shrugged slightly. "So maybe she hitchhiked with someone." In that brief moment, Henson noticed Ray's hands, the nails flecked with small white bits, like lime powder, and on his right wrist a long fresh scratch, scabbed over. "When did that happen?" he asked. Ray glanced at his wrist. "When I was hauling cement bags. Those bags are heavy." Henson said nothing more, just glanced at Ridley to signal photographing the hands. After checking the entire property, they collected soil, cement and lime samples from the shed, bagging and numbering them. On the way to the car, Henson paused and looked back over his shoulder. The house stood still, its gray walls swallowing the light. There was something here that made him feel suffocated, that familiar sensation every time the truth lay right underfoot, but he didn't yet have the right to touch it. That afternoon, he returned to the county office and called the Illinois State Forensics Lab in Springfield, requesting technicians to come collect scene samples. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. On the other end, the manager's dry voice came through. "No body, no blood, no crime. You know the rules, Henson." He hung up, staring at the unsigned request form. As the sun set, Henson sat in his car in front of the Whitfield gate, watching the maple trees sway in the wind. He felt a cold intuition clawing at his mind, the kind only longtime cops understand. There had been a death here. No evidence, no witnesses, but every small detail in that house, from the open lime bag, the tarpaulin, to the fresh cement, were pieces of the same picture. He started the car, drove away from the street, leaving behind the golden light spilling from the empty house. In the rearview mirror, that image shrank, but the heaviness clung. Even without a digging warrant, Henson knew, sooner or later, he'd have to come back. And next time, he wouldn't come empty-handed. On the morning of July 29, 1945, Decatur's sky was blanketed in thick gray clouds. The previous night's rain had washed away the dry dust, leaving a heavy earth smell permeating the air. After the Whitfield house search revealed a series of suspicious signs, Sheriff Robert Henson officially launched a small-scale search around the Sangamon River area, where Ray's truck had last been seen the night Eleanor vanished. The search team consisted of 15 people, 7 police officers, 4 local volunteers, 2 firefighters, and 2 handler dog units from Springfield. Overhead, a Piper Cub plane from the Decatur Flying Club was dispatched for aerial observation. At that time, a disappearance search of this scale was rare in Macon County. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. The police no longer believed Eleanor Whitfield had just gone on vacation in Missouri. Henson divided the team into 3 groups. The first combed the dirt road along the riverbank, where someone had seen the small truck pass that night of the 20th. The second expanded north into the dense maple woods bordering Decatur. The remaining group, with the working dogs, followed the water's edge, where the Sangamon wound around sandbars and tall reed thickets. On the first morning, no one spoke much. Every footstep imprinted on the soft mud, every rustle of leaves made them pause and listen. The 2 working dogs, Rex and Molly, sniffed every patch of grass, sometimes barking loudly at a strange scent, but then falling silent when they found nothing. Henson walked with the first group, his coat caked in mud, his eyes scanning every tree trunk, every puddle. Near noon, Officer Ridley called out loudly, "Boss, tire tracks here." Henson approached. On the muddy dirt road, 2 shallow tire marks ran parallel before vanishing into the edge of the reeds. Henson bent down, estimating the tire size at about 16 inches, matching the tires on Ray's Ford Deluxe. He marked the spot with a stick, took a few photos. But the heavy rain from the night before had blurred all the prints, mud washing down and covering nearly all the edges. Only a faint shape remained, enough to suggest something like evidence of a presence, then gone. That afternoon, the search team continued expanding toward the northern woods. They waded through damp meadows, combed through every bush. The musty smell of rotten leaves mixed with river mist made everyone feel suffocated. A volunteer spotted a scrap of white fabric caught on a low branch, but it turned out to be just an old rag. Along the riverbank, the water was high, the current swift and murky, making it impossible to drag with boats. Henson stood on the bank, looking down at the black water, gripping the brim of his hat tightly. If she was thrown in here, she's long gone downstream. On the second day, The working dogs swept the area around the Whitfield house again. They reacted slightly behind the shed, where the soil had been freshly disturbed, but Henson had no warrant to dig, so he had to stop. He just silently watched the two dogs barking in the same direction, then bowed his head and signaled to move on. On the third day, the Piper cub flew low along the Sangamon River, the pilot scanning the shallows with binoculars. Nothing. Only a few rotten logs, floating grass clumps, and glints of sunlight reflecting off the water. On the fourth day, the harsh sun returned, making the search even more exhausting. An officer collapsed from heat stroke, the water packs nearly empty. Henson had to call a lunch break under the trees. He unfolded the map, crossing off searched areas, leaving only a narrow strip on the East Riverbank unchecked. But by sunset, the results were still empty. No fabric scrap, no belongings, no human traces. On the morning of the fifth day, a reporter from the Decatur Herald arrived at the staging area, asking permission to take photos. He asked, "I hear his wife disappeared after an argument. Does the police suspect foul play?" Henson didn't answer, just said curtly, "We're looking for a missing woman. Nothing more, nothing less." That afternoon, the paper ran a big headline on the front page: Decatur teacher's mysterious disappearance, police search along Sangamon River. The news spread quickly through town. A few neighbors brought food and water to support the search team. Others just stood at a distance watching, gossiping about the sweet teacher at number 47. That evening, Henson held a quick meeting with the officers at the scene. All investigative leads were dead ends. No body, no new clues, the tire tracks washed away by rain. "We can't keep groping in the dark," he said, his voice dropping low. "If she's here, the river's taken her." The fifth day ended with a pale sunset, fog blanketing the water's surface. Henson was the last to leave the riverbank. He stood for a long time looking down at the still water, where the last rays of sun reflected like dull metal shards. He knew the search was over, at least on paper, but in his heart, he felt no peace. There was something about this case in Ray's indifferent eyes, in the fresh cement under the shed floor, in the rain-erased tire tracks. All of it seemed to tell him that Eleanor Whitfield had never left Decatur. She was still here. It was just that no one had dug deep enough to find her. 3 days after the Sangamon River search was forced to pause, Sheriff Robert Henson returned to the county office with a heavy sense of failure. 5 days of combing, 2 working dogs, a whole plane circling the riverbank, but nothing found. Not a single belonging, not a trace. Everything slipped away in silence, leaving only the question, how had Eleanor Whitfield vanished? Henson sat at his desk, staring at the stack of documents, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. He opened his notebook, flipping back to the notes on the lime bag, the tarpaulin, and the fresh cement in the shed, details that couldn't be ignored. If something was buried, he muttered, there has to be a record of buying materials. That thought made him stand up abruptly. That afternoon, Henson stopped by Macon Hardware, located at the corner of Main and Water Streets, selling everything from farm tools to building supplies. The store had been operating in Decatur for nearly 20 years, owned by Harold Baxter, a balding man with a cautious demeanor. When Henson introduced himself and asked if anyone named Ray Whitfield had bought lime or tarpaulin in the past week, Baxter didn't need to think long. He pulled a thick invoice book from the drawer, flipped a few pages, and stopped. July 18th, R. Whitfield, 1 bag of lime, 2 coils of sisal rope, 1 tarpaulin, and a box of nails. Total $6.40. Henson stared at the black ink handwriting, neat and clear, like a needle stabbing straight into his chain of suspicions. Ray had bought everything that could be used to hide a body, and bought it just 2 days before Eleanor disappeared. "Do you remember him?" Henson asked. Baxter nodded. "Sure do. He said he was repairing a shed floor. I even joked that pouring lime in July takes forever to dry, and he just laughed." "Did he seem in a hurry?" "Yeah," said Little. "Paid cash." Henson asked to photocopy the page and noted the date. As he left the store, he held the invoice copy in his hand, his heart heavy. It all fit, the open lime bag in the shed, the fresh cement floor, the shovel with wet mud. But it still wasn't enough for another search warrant. No body, everything still just suspicion. The next day, while re-examining Eleanor's belongings collected from the house, Henson found an unsealed envelope in the desk drawer. It was addressed to Thunder Creek Readers Group, the book club Eleanor attended weekly. The typed letter, on cream-colored paper, with even, tidy letters. The content was brief. Dear friends, I will be absent for a while. Need to leave Decatur to sort out some personal matters. Happy reading to you all, Eleanor. The tone was completely different from the handwriting in the cards and letters of hers that Henson had seen, terse, stiff, without a hint of her usual gentleness. Even more, she had misspelled the book club's name, something her friend said she would never do. Under the desk lamp, he examined each typed line closely. The spacing between letters was uneven, a few characters slightly raised, especially the E and R. That afternoon, Henson summoned Ray Whitfield to the station again. When asked about the letter, Ray frowned, speaking quickly. I've never seen that before. Maybe she had someone type it for her. She wasn't good at typing. Do you know who she might have asked? No. She had lots of friends in the book club. And you insist you didn't type it? Ray looked straight ahead, his voice cold. I don't forge letters. If she wanted to go, she had the right. Henson was silent for a few seconds, then gently folded the letter and put it in the file bag. He noticed Ray answered too quickly, his tone rigid, and especially evasive when it came to the typewriter in the house, a Remington portable on the living room shelf, dust on the keys, but fresh ink still in the ribbon. Even as the clues began to chain together, Henson still hit the familiar wall of the era, lack of direct evidence. No blood, no body, no witnesses to the crime. The county prosecutor's office concluded the case lacked criminal elements. They advised Henson to temporarily close the file, await further information. In the official record, the case status was changed. Missing person, voluntary disappearance. On August 2nd, Henson went to the county office and personally signed the investigation suspended line. He knew he couldn't do more. But before transferring the file to storage, he quietly kept a copy of the Macon hardware invoice, along with 2 scene photos of the shed, where the fresh light-colored cement and damp soil patches were still clearly imprinted on the floor. He put it all in a separate envelope, locked it in the desk drawer. On the corner of the envelope, he wrote in pencil, "If anyone reopens this, start here." That evening, as he left the office, Henson paused by the window for a moment. Across the street, the afternoon papers had just been delivered, bold headlines running across the front page of the Decatur Herald. Police end search. Decatur teacher Eleanor Whitfield's disappearance unsolved. He looked at those words, gripped his hat tightly, then turned away. In his heart, he knew this case wasn't over. It had only just begun to sink, like the fresh cement in the backyard shed. In 1946, winter came early. Snow blanketed the small streets of Decatur, and Eleanor Whitfield's disappearance gradually faded from the daily rhythm of life in this industrial town. As war news ended, as soldiers returned and factories ramped up again, no one mentioned much anymore the woman who had vanished from the small house on North Jasper Street. In the Macon County Archives, file number 1945-217 was placed in a wooden box with dozens of other unsolved cases, dust thickening over the years, covering even the words, missing person, voluntary. The Whitfield house, after Ray sold it in 1947, changed hands a few times and then stood empty. People said the last tenants moved out in the middle of the night, claiming the house smelled of lime and damp, and the neighbor dogs often barked whenever the wind blew through the fence. Old neighbors gradually passed away. Newcomers moving in remembered nothing of Eleanor Whitfield's name. To them, the gray house was just another rundown place, like so many in the decaying suburb. Sheriff Robert Henson retired in 1958, after 30 years of service. He lived quietly in a small house outside town, spending time reading books and tending his garden. Occasionally, he still thought about that disappearance, the only case in his career where he never found answers. Every time he opened the desk drawer, he still saw the envelope with the Macon hardware invoice copy and the 2 black and white photos of the Whitfield shed. He hadn't been able to convince superiors to excavate that patch of ground, but his belief never faded. One evening in 1963, while sorting papers, Henson carefully placed that envelope in a small wooden box, noting on the lid, "If anyone finds her, check this invoice first." He folded the paper, placed it with the photo, and locked it in the cabinet. 2 years later, Henson passed away in his sleep, taking his unanswered questions with him. Time passed, and Decatur changed. North Jasper Street was widened, part of the land around the Sangamon River rezoned for industrial use. The Whitfield house was finally abandoned, walls peeling, windows broken, weeds overtaking the path. Occasionally a few curious kids slipped through the fence, saying the house still smelled like lime and metal or something. But no one cared. The town had new problems, new people, and the old story from 1945 was just a faint rumor among dozens of unsolved disappearances across the state. By the early 2000s, the state of Illinois established the Cold Case Investigation Unit, a special program to review unsolved cases from the previous century. In the first investigative team was Allison Henson, granddaughter of Robert Henson, a young detective known for her meticulousness and sharp memory. Allison grew up in her grandfather's old house, listening to her father tell about the case of the woman and the house that smelled like lime. She didn't know details, only remembered her grandfather saying, "It all started with an invoice." When she transferred to Springfield for work, Allison stumbled upon Eleanor Whitfield's name in the list of the state's 200 oldest disappearances. She recognized the shared surname and asked superiors for access to the old files. At the Macon County archives, amid thousands of dusty boxes, she opened a yellowed file folder. The words Case #1945, 217 nearly faded. Inside were black and white photos of the gray house, a few ink-written notes, and the intact Macon hardware invoice copy. At the corner of the paper, her grandfather's shaky pencil handwriting still stood out. "If anyone finds her, start here." Allison froze. She understood that what she held wasn't just an old file. It was a message across 6 decades, from a cop who had failed to the next generation that might finish what he couldn't. In that moment, she didn't know that, just a few months away, a construction worker in suburban Decatur would dig up what had been buried for 60 years, and the case the whole town thought dead would come alive again. In June 2004, nearly 60 years after Eleanor Whitfield vanished, the vacant lot where 47 North Jasper once stood was unrecognizable. The old traces of the wooden house had long been bulldozed, leaving only cracked concrete foundations and a few rotted wall sections overgrown with ivy. Midwest Bioenergy Company bought the plot to break ground on an ethanol plant, part of the Sangamon River waterfront redevelopment project. That morning, as the sun rose over the factory roofs, the excavator roared, tearing up soil that had lain dormant for over half a century. Around 9 in the morning, Eddie Nolan, the excavator operator, was digging to a depth of nearly 5 feet when the iron bucket hit something hard. He thought it was a rock, so he lowered the arm further. The blade hooked up a round, metallic object, about 2 feet in diameter. "It didn't feel like a pipe," Eddie recalled later. "That thing made a hollow clang, echoing and cold like dead steel." He shut off the machine and signaled everyone to stop. Another worker shoveled around it, and within minutes, the group saw a rusted metal drum, half buried, its mouth facing upward. No one dared open it. Eddie called the site manager, who immediately contacted the Decatur Police Department. By nearly 10 o'clock, 2 police cars arrived. Lieutenant Brian Cooper, the scene commander, quickly cordoned off the area, stringing up yellow police line. "Do not cross" tape. Under the midday sun, the ground steamed with moisture, the smell of rust and decayed earth mingling. Cooper approached, examining closely. The drum was so old that the outer paint had flaked off in patches, with only a few spots where faded printing was still legible. "Macon hardware," Lot 45B. Those words made him pause. That store had closed in the 1950s, and according to archives, it was in the same neighborhood as the old Whitfield house. Cooper signaled criminal technician Karen Doyle to take photos, then carefully instructed the workers to use a cable to hoist the drum up. Once the soil was cleared, they saw the mouth sealed with an iron lid, the rim coated in a thin layer of cement. Someone wanted it never to be opened, Karen said quietly. Under the sunlight, brown rust stains spread like dried blood. The police decided to transport the entire drum to the crime lab, but before moving it, they needed to open and inspect preliminarily on site. Karen put on gloves and used a metal saw to cut part of the lid. As the metal separated, a pungent stench rose, a smell of mildew, oil, and old decomposition, so ancient it became something indescribable. One of the workers stepped back, covering his nose. Inside was rolled tarpaulin, dark black, stuck with dry mud, and tightly wrapped with old sisal ropes. Karen gently pulled back a layer of tarp, revealing something that stunned the group. A small bone fragment, whitish, likely an arm bone. Beside it was a metal hairpin, green with rust, and a human tooth with intact enamel. "Stop. Don't touch anything else," Cooper ordered, his voice dropping low. The scene was quickly sealed off. Forensic personnel were called from the Illinois State Crime Lab in Springfield, along with a specialized evidence transport vehicle. They lifted the drum onto the truck with a small crane, sealed it in an airtight plastic container, labeled Evidence #040621DCT. Soil from the surrounding area was sampled, photographed, and coordinates marked. That afternoon, the news spread. Workers were sent home, the construction site temporarily shut down. On local TV, the evening news opened with a ticker at the bottom of the screen. Mysterious drum found at North Jasper construction site. Police suspect linked to old case. In the Springfield lab, technician Dr. Martin Kellogg and the forensics team opened the drum in sterile conditions. They removed each layer of old tarpaulin, untied the sisal ropes, and spread the contents on a stainless steel table. The initial report noted 2 long bone fragments, arm and pelvis bones, 1 human molar, 1 stainless steel hairpin, tarpaulin soaked in asphalt, manufactured in the mid-1940s, half-inch sisal rope, common type used in agriculture during World War II. As Kellogg wiped the drum's side clean, he noticed the lot number Lot 45B, still clearly readable. He checked the state's old materials database in 1945. Macon Hardware had distributed these 55-gallon drums to Decatur area residents. Only 3 invoices recorded that July, one in the name of Ray Whitfield. 3 days later, preliminary analysis results were sent to the Decatur Police Department. The bone and tooth samples all belonged to an adult female, age 30, 35. Deceased approximately 50 to 60 years prior. No signs of sharp trauma, but the skull fragment, broken off, showed evidence of possible blunt force impact before death. Lieutenant Cooper held the report, pausing at the line gender female. He looked at Karen Doyle, who was reorganizing the evidence. "Do you remember a disappearance in this area back in the 40s?" he asked. Karen checked the list, then looked up. "Whitfield. Eleanor Whitfield, teacher, disappeared in 1945. No one said another word. In that moment of silence, everyone understood they might have just touched the solution to a mystery spanning 6 decades. Cooper stood up, picked up the phone, and dialed Springfield. "I need to speak with the Illinois State Cold Case Unit. Someone needs to be found." That afternoon, Decatur's sky was tinged red, sunlight falling on the patch of ground where the drum had been unearthed. That plot of land for 60 years had lain still like an unmarked grave, until Eddie Nolan's excavator bucket accidentally brushed against the memory of an entire case that everyone thought had been buried with time. When the news of the rusted drum unearthed at the North Jasper construction site reached Springfield, the Illinois State Cold Case Investigation Unit was immediately mobilized. One afternoon in early July 2004, Allison Henson, the youngest investigator in the unit, and granddaughter of the late Sheriff Robert Henson, received a summary report from the Decatur Police Department. In the list of evidence was a detail that stunned her: the drum label printed with Macon hardware, Lot 45B. Allison quickly flipped through her grandfather's old notebook, the one she still kept in her desk drawer. Amid the yellowed pages, his shaky pencil handwriting was still clear. "If anyone finds her, start with the Macon hardware invoice." Her heart raced. Right in the original 1945 file she had read the previous month, the invoice copy clearly stated, July 18, 1945. R. Whitfield, 1 bag of lime, 2 coils of sisal rope, 1 tarpaulin, 1 drum, Lot 45B. 60 years later, the same lot number had resurfaced on the artifact just excavated. No doubt about it, Allison knew she was standing at the biggest turning point of her career, and perhaps the final message from the grandfather she had never met. She immediately called the Decatur Police Department, requesting access to the new evidence files. 2 hours later, Allison was at the old scene, now just a wide dirt hole, surrounded by yellow tape. The sun was setting, copper light shining on the ground where her grandfather had once stood nearly 60 years ago. In the police station conference room, Allison presented the comparison results to the local officers and the Macon County prosecutor. She opened 2 parallel files, the 1945 invoice and the 2004 evidence log. Lot number 45B matches. The sisal rope, tarpaulin and drum are all the same type of goods, Macon hardware imported that July. The buyer is listed as R. Whitfield, the husband of the victim who disappeared at the same time. The room fell silent. The elderly prosecutor looked up, speaking slowly. "You're saying we have physical evidence linking a 1945 disappearance directly to evidence found this year?" "All evidence points that way, sir," Allison replied, her voice firm. The next day, she sent the official report to the Illinois State Prosecutor's Office, requesting the case be reclassified from missing to suspected homicide. The report spanned over 60 pages, including comparison images between old and new evidence, the invoice copy, 1945 shed photos, and her grandfather's final note. 3 days later, approval came back. File case hash 1945-217 was officially reopened under a new name: Suspicious Death, Eleanor Whitfield. The Illinois governor approved special funding for a joint federal and local investigation team consisting of Illinois State Cold Case Unit, led by Allison Henson. Decatur Police Department, represented by Lieutenant Brian Cooper, the discoverer of the drum. Springfield Forensics Lab, responsible for evidence analysis and victim identification. State Archives Office, tasked with restoring and copying the original 1945 files. The first meeting took place in a small room at the Decatur Police Department. Allison stood before a whiteboard, writing a large title, The Whitfield Case, 1945, 2004. Below it she drew 2 arrows connecting the 2 timelines: July 1945, disappearance, no body; June 2004 drum, evidence matching invoice. "We may not have DNA," Allison said, her voice resolute, "but we have logic, documents, and physical evidence. Those things don't lie." The team's first task was to catalog all evidence for comparison. They gathered everything related: purchase invoices, 1945 scene photos, the typed letter to the book club, soil and cement samples from the shed, and the list of old witnesses. Allison requested reanalysis of the rope and tarpaulin samples using carbon isotope methods, a technology unavailable in her grandfather's time. Additionally, the team searched for former Macon hardware employees or their relatives, hoping to confirm the supply chain from that year. As the meeting ended, Decatur's sky had fully darkened. Allison stood alone in the room, looking up at the whiteboard. In the corner of the board, she added a line, exactly like the handwriting Robert Henson had left in the old file: "If anyone finds her, start with the invoice." Now, 60 years later, the one who found that invoice was his granddaughter, and she knew the Eleanor Whitfield case was finally being restarted, not just as a duty, but as a promise kept whole. Throughout August 2004, the forensics lab in Springfield was almost never without lights. On the stainless steel table, the evidence retrieved from the rusted drum was laid out neatly. Individual sisal rope fibers, black tarpaulin scraps, bone fragments, and the human tooth still gleaming with a faint enamel sheen. The entire Illinois State Cold Case team, led by Allison Henson, monitored every step of the analysis because they knew that just one matching piece of evidence to the 1945 file would connect the entire mystery. Dr. Martin Kellogg, the forensics team lead, started with a rope. Under the electron microscope, the twisted fibers showed a triple braid structure common in the 1940s. He carefully cut a small segment and fed it into the spectrometer, saying, "This is sisal rope imported from Cuba, the same type Macon hardware distributed from 1943, 1946. Kellogg opened the old warehouse log the team had obtained. Lot 45B matched exactly the batch sold to Ray Whitfield that July. No mistake. This rope is nearly 60 years old, produced in a short run just before the war ended. Next was the rolled tarpaulin from the drum. When washed with a special solvent, the outer black asphalt layer dissolved, revealing thick jute fabric with a distinct bitumen smell. Chemical composition analysis via infrared spectroscopy showed it contained bitumen A45, an industrial asphalt used for waterproofing in civilian construction. This bitumen matches the batch Macon hardware imported in June 1945 for residents sealing roofs or foundations, Kellogg explained. Allison listened silently, her eyes fixed on the display screen. Each result confirmed what she had intuited. Everything in the drum traced back to the same source, the hardware store where Ray had shopped 2 days before his wife vanished. The forensics team moved on to analyzing the human bone fragments. They were cleaned and CT scanned to reconstruct form. The bone surfaces had tiny white specks. At first, Kellogg thought they were natural soil minerals, but when reacting with dilute acid, he realized they were slaked lime calcium hydroxide, the exact type used in construction or odor control. Lime doesn't appear on bones randomly unless there's direct contact before burial, he said. They compared this lime sample to the one recorded in Ray Whitfield's 1945 purchase log. The chemical composition matched to the thousandth. Both contained the high magnesium ratio characteristic of lime produced at Macon Lime Works, the main supplier to Macon hardware in the post-war period. Allison stood still before the lab table, looking at the white bone fragments spread under the lights. He doused the body in lime to neutralize the smell, she said quietly. Then wrapped it in tarpaulin, tied with sisal rope, and put it in the drum. Everyone in the room fell silent. What had once been a hypothesis in her grandfather's 1945 report was now stark reality. The lab continued with calcium isotope analysis on the bones, a technique only developed in recent years. The results showed a circumflex 44K/circumflex 42K ratio in the bones consistent with Decatur's groundwater in Macon County, distinct from other Illinois areas. That meant the woman had lived in the Decatur area for years before death, a fact matching perfectly with Eleanor Whitfield's profile as a local high school teacher. That evening, Allison returned to the office and spread all the evidence photos across the desk. The dark sisal rope, the pitch-black tarpaulin, the lime-flecked bone fragments, all pieces scattered over 6 decades, now closing in the same room. She opened her grandfather's old file, rereading the slanted purple ink lines. No body, but fresh cement open lime bag and hastily cut rope. She smiled faintly. "You were right, Grandpa." Before leaving the office, Allison added a short note to the end of her comprehensive report. Forensic analysis confirms evidence in the drum matches materials sold by Macon Hardware in July 1945 to R. Whitfield. Lime on bones matches the lime he bought. Calcium isotopes indicate victim lived around Decatur. Everything leads back to the Whitfield house. The nearly 80-page report was sent straight to the state prosecutor's office the next morning. With those words, the case once thought erased by time now had a new header on the file's front page. Eleanor Whitfield, suspicious death, verified by physical evidence. For the first time in nearly 60 years, Decatur heard the name of that long-ago teacher again, but this time, not in rumors, but in the official investigation record. As soon as the forensics report arrived from Springfield, Allison Henson knew she had one more task: find answers for the 1945 type letter, the only document that had once labeled Eleanor's disappearance as voluntary. That letter, sent to the Thunder Creek Readers Book Group, stating Eleanor needed to go away for a while to rest, had been the key evidence that halted her grandfather's entire investigation back then. If she could prove it was forged, everything would change. In the archives, the letter was typed on pale yellow paper, common office stock in the 1940s. The characters were even and spaced uniformly, except for the two letters A and R, slightly raised above the line, a mechanical flaw characteristic of the Remington Portable 5, a popular compact typewriter in America at the time. Henson had noted this in 1945, but back then, there was no technology to compare keystrokes. Allison took the letter to the State Document Examination Unit, where technician Dr. Leonard Greer, expert in restoring ancient texts, was on duty. Greer examined it under a microscope, then nodded. Definitely a Remington Noan 5. This model uses a single spring mechanism, and only those produced from 1939 to 1946 have this E-axis misalignment flaw. If we find the specific machine, we can pinpoint the source. The problem was, the Remington once in the Whitfield house had vanished. In her grandfather's 1945 report, it was noted as typewriter on living room shelf, dust-covered fresh ink. Later, when the house changed hands, old furnishings were dispersed. Allison needed to know who had it. She traced Ray Whitfield's family tree through civil records, then called the Peoria Veterans Home, where Ray had lived for years before dying. The record showed he had a grandson, Thomas Whitfield, still living in Peoria, who occasionally visited his grandfather in his final years. Allison contacted him, introducing herself as an Illinois state investigator, looking into an old case related to his family. The next afternoon, she drove nearly 3 hours to Peoria. Thomas greeted her on the porch of his small house by the Illinois River, his face a mix of curiosity and worry. "I've heard about Mrs. Eleanor's disappearance, but that was before I was born," he said. "My grandfather was very private. As a kid, I just knew he used to repair machines, and the house had dozens of old typewriters. When he passed, I kept one because it looked nice." Allison followed his gesture. In the corner of the living room, under a thick layer of dust, was a black Remington Portable No. 5, silver lettering faded, leather case cracked. She approached, gently opening the lid. Inside, the keys gleamed under the slanting afternoon sun, the E and R characters noticeably misaligned compared to the others. Her heart raced. "Can I take it for testing?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "If it helps clear things up, take it." 3 days later, in the document lab, Dr. Greer placed the original letter next to a fresh test print from the found Remington. Under the microscope, every detail was clear: the small notch on the R stem, the 0.4 mm offset from the baseline, and the faint blurring on the right edge of the E, an exact match to the 1945 letter's characters. "No doubt about it," Greer said, placing the two samples side by side. "The letter was typed on this exact machine. Can't be coincidence." Allison looked down at the letter's final line, "Happy reading to you all, Eleanor," and read it aloud softly, her voice dropping, and he typed it himself. In the report to the state prosecutor, she stated clearly, "Conclusion. The 1945 letter was typed on a Remington Portable No. 5, same model and serial number as the machine owned by Ray Whitfield, verified via Air Thomas Whitfield, Peoria. Character mechanics analysis shows E and R key offsets match perfectly. Conclusion. The letter is forged, typed by Ray Whitfield himself, to stage a voluntary departure by his wife." The 25-page report was sent straight to the Illinois State Prosecutor's office the next morning. With it, all suspicions turned to proof. Now, they not only had the drum, lime, rope, and bones, but also a forged document, penned by the hand of the man who had tried to cover his crime. That afternoon, as the cold case team meeting ended, Allison stood looking at the whiteboard where suspicious death, Eleanor Whitfield, was crossed out, replaced by a bolder new line: homicide investigation, Ray Whitfield, suspect. She stared at those words for a long time, then placed her hand on the cool board. 60 years ago, her grandfather had written in his final report, "If the letter is found, ask who typed it." Now, that question had an answer, and the 1945 disappearance was officially reclassified as murder. After proving the 1945 letter was forged, the Joint Federal-Local Investigation Team officially classified the Eleanor Whitfield case as homicide. However, to prosecute, they still needed the final step: confirming the identity of the body in the drum. No one wanted to err in this 60-year-old case. In the morning meeting early September 2004, Dr. Martin Kellogg, Springfield forensics lead, proposed, "We need Eleanor's dental records. If they exist, that'll be the surest proof." Allison Henson got right to it. She combed through all administrative records from 1945, searching for dentists practicing in Decatur. After days of digging in the Macon County archives, she found an old listing in the 1944 directory: Dr. Charles Barnes, Dentistry and Oral Surgery, St. Mary's Hospital, Decatur, Illinois. Allison wasn't sure if he was still alive, but St. Mary's Hospital was still operating. She drove there, bringing a copy of the old license. In the basement archives, an elderly archivist found a hardbound box labeled Barnes, C. Dental Patients, 1938-1945. When opened, amid dozens of yellowed sheets, Allison saw Eleanor Whitfield's name typed neatly at the top of a page. Inside was a dental chart from April 12, 1944, with X-rays of both jaws and Dr. Barnes's handwritten notes. Left molar #14 silver-filled, right incisor slightly rotated. Allison carefully copied the records and took them back to the Springfield forensics lab. In the lab, Dr. Kellogg placed the old X-ray film next to the tooth and jawbone samples from the drum. Under the blue light of the viewer, the images came into sharp focus. He rotated the tooth gently in the tweezers, comparing it to the photo. A moment later, he looked up, his voice firm. Perfect match. On the microscope screen, the silver filling on the left molar of the sample had the exact shape and position as the tooth in the 1944 X-ray. The same depth, same cutting angle, even the small 0.2 mm offset filling line on the left edge identical. Additionally, the victim's right incisor was slightly tilted inward, matching exactly the slight rotation description in Dr. Barnes's records. Kellogg looked around the investigation team. No doubt about it. The person in the drum is Eleanor Whitfield. Further analysis of the skull bones, found in the drum's bottom sediment, showed a large fracture on the left occipital region, with a crescent-shaped break line. No knife or gunshot traces, but blunt force trauma from a heavy object, like a hammer or shovel handle. Based on mineralization levels and bone tissue analysis, Kellogg concluded time of death in July 1945, with a margin of no more than 3 weeks. Hearing the report, Allison said nothing for several minutes. For 60 years, that woman's name had existed only in rumors, in a forgotten file folder. Now, science had restored her true identity, and with it, the case officially had a victim, a weapon, motive, and perpetrator. That afternoon, in the Springfield cold case office, Allison opened her grandfather's old file. On the final page, the faded ink line read, "No body, no justice." She gently closed the notebook, whispering to herself, "Now, the body has been found." In Macon County, Illinois, State Prosecutor Thomas Grady received the entire forensics results and new investigation files. He spent the evening reading through nearly 200 pages of documents: the 1945 invoice, the Lot 45B drum, the sisal rope, the lime samples, the forged letter, the Remington No. 5 typewriter, and the perfectly matching dental report. When he closed the file, he said to his assistant, "We have everything enough to bring Ray Whitfield to trial, whether he's alive or just a shadow. On October 15, 2004, Grady signed the arrest warrant for Ray Whitfield, now 98 years old, living at Peoria Veterans Home, a nursing facility for veterans. The indictment clearly stated the charge: first-degree murder premeditated, Eleanor Whitfield, July 1945. Basis: physical evidence, forensic examination, and forged documents created by the suspect. Allison looked at the bold print on the warrant, feeling a mix of cold and relief. The final piece had fallen into place. Outside the window, sunset draped over Springfield, the light casting on the old buildings like rusted copper, the same as the patina on the drum that had held the secret for 60 years. Tomorrow, she would go with the task force to Peoria. The case her grandfather had once considered the greatest failure of his life was about to be opened one last time. And this time, she would be the one to put the period at the end of it. On the morning of August 15, 2005, Peoria's sky was covered in a thin fog, weak sunlight filtering through the maple trees at the gate of Peoria Veterans Home, the nursing facility for World War II veterans. None of the morning shift staff knew that today, this quiet red brick building would become the scene of the most extraordinary arrest in Illinois state judicial history. At 7:10, 4 Illinois State Police cars quietly pulled up to the gate. The local sheriff signaled to cordon off the area, requiring all reporters to stay at least 100 meters away. In the lead car, Allison Henson sat in the back, clutching the arrest warrant, signed by State Prosecutor Thomas Grady, an indictment for first-degree murder against Ray Whitfield, 98 years old, veteran, resident of room 214, Building A. 60 years after his wife vanished, justice had finally come calling. The investigation team walked into the quiet hallway of the nursing home. The scent of disinfectant and early brewed coffee mingled in the air. A nurse pointed the way, her voice trembling. "Mr. Whitfield is at the end of the hall, near the east window." Wheelchairs rolling on the tile floor made a faint crunching sound. Allison led the way, her face calm, but her heart a tangle of indescribable emotions, cold, closing, like a film rewinding to its end. When they stopped at room 214, the door was ajar. In the dim light, Ray Whitfield sat in a wooden chair by the window, draped in a thin sweater, his gaunt arms resting on the armrests. He turned his head, his eyes still bright, eerily calm. It was as if he had known they were coming. "Allison Henson, Illinois State Police," she said, her voice low and firm. "Mr. Ray Whitfield, you are under arrest for first-degree murder in connection with the death of your wife, Eleanor Whitfield. July 1945. In the long moment of silence, only the ticking clock and the sound of a wheelchair in the hall could be heard. The old man closed his eyes briefly, his lips moving. Then he opened them, looking straight at Allison, his voice raspy and slow. "It's time." No resistance, no questions, not a word of denial. When 2 officers stepped forward to cuff him, Ray extended his frail wrists, remaining seated. Allison stood watching, saying nothing. In her eyes, this man was no longer a suspect, but the final piece of a story that both her grandfather and all of Decatur had missed. Outside, the news spread quickly. Local media outlets received the official press release from the prosecutor's office. 98-year-old veteran arrested for 1945. Wife's murder, Illinois' coldest case revived. On television, black and white photos of Eleanor appeared, the woman with curly hair, gentle smile, next to a new photo of Ray, aged, hunched, eyes cloudy. The story immediately rocked the entire state. While the task force completed the transfer paperwork, Allison stepped closer to the old man, leaning down. "Do you want to take anything with you?" Ray shook his head slightly. "No, just one thing. I stayed silent too long." Then he looked out the window, where the maple branches cast shadows on the facility grounds. As they let him out, dozens of reporters had gathered at the gate. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Flashbulbs popped. Amid the circle of lenses, the black police car rolled slowly away, carrying the man who had survived war but could not escape his own guilt. On the drive back to Decatur, Allison looked out the car window. She saw Ray's reflection in the glass, his weathered face, eyes half closed, a chill serenity. No remorse, no excuses. Perhaps in his mind, the 60-year journey had finally reached its stop. And for him, it was a release. That afternoon, the Decatur Herald's front-page story opened with bold letters. Eleanor Whitfield case, after 6 decades, justice is called by name. But for Allison, justice was no cause for cheers. As the car crossed the Sangamon River, she gazed at the grayish water, imagining that July night long ago, when truck headlights swept across the fence, when the 2 dogs barking tore through the darkness, and when a woman was buried under damp soil that no one heard. Now, the one who caused it all sat silently in the back seat, hands trembling in cuffs, staring into the distance. And for the first time since Eleanor's disappearance, Decatur could begin to speak of that past, not as rumor, but as truth. The interrogation room on the 2nd floor of the Illinois State Police Station in Decatur, a square room with gray-painted walls, cold fluorescent lights casting down on the metal table. On the afternoon of August 16, 2005, just 1 day after his arrest, Ray Whitfield, 98 years old, was brought here for questioning. Outside, the sky was overcast, wind carrying the scent of rain, and in the room so quiet, you could hear the faint scratch of pen on paper. Allison Henson, along with State Prosecutor Thomas Grady and the recording technician, sat across from him. Ray wore a thin sweater, his shoulders trembling slightly from the cold, but his eyes bright and alert in an uncanny way. On the table was a cup of cold coffee, a thick stack of files, and a photo of the Remington portable No. 5 typewriter. The evidence that had turned the case around. Allison began in a steady voice. Mr. Ray Whitfield, today we want to talk about the night of July 20th, 1945. Do you remember that night? Ray looked up, his voice raspy but firm. I already told you. She left. I don't know where. The first 3 hours passed slowly. The old man sat still, answering briefly, sometimes just shaking his head or closing his eyes in silence. Allison laid out each piece of evidence before him, one by one, photos of the drum, sisal rope, tarpaulin, the lime analysis report, and finally, the copy of the 1945 Macon hardware invoice. Where he had bought all those things. Do you remember this invoice? Allison asked. Ray glanced at it and shook his head. I bought a lot of stuff. I was fixing the house. Fixing the house, or burying your wife. Grady interjected, his voice icy. Ray showed no reaction, just looked down at his dry, bony hands. Allison didn't interrupt. She changed tactics, her voice softer. Did you ever type? The Remington we found at your grandson's house, you used it, right? Ray nodded slightly. Yes, I used it for work logs back at the factory. She placed the letter on the table, the forged letter to Eleanor's book club. We know this exact machine typed that letter, not Eleanor. Elaine Wu could have written it, because the E and R misalignments match perfectly. He looked up, staring at the paper for a long time. For a moment, his eyes changed, not defensive, just heavy with exhaustion. Then he asked, his voice raspy, where did you find the drum? Allison replied, right on your old property, where 47 North Jasper used to be. Ray fell silent. No one in the room moved. In the hall outside, the clock ticked slowly. Finally, he took a deep breath, his trembling hand resting on the typewriter photo. She kept wanting to leave, said I was selfish, that I only cared about myself. She didn't understand. I lost my job, lost everything. I was afraid she'd leave me. His voice broke, raspy like dry wind scraping glass. Allison didn't interrupt. She let him speak, gently sliding a blank sheet of paper and pen toward him. Ray continued, eyes fixed on the table. That night we argued. She said she'd leave the next morning. I grabbed her arm to hold her back. She pulled away, then fell. Her head hit the corner of the table. I called to her, but she didn't answer. He paused, looking up. his eyes wet, but his voice terrifyingly calm. I thought, she just fainted. But when I touched her, she was getting cold. I panicked. Allison froze. What he said matched almost exactly the hypothesis her grandfather had formed 60 years ago. She only asked softly, "What did you do after that?" Ray bowed his head slightly, his hand gripping the pen tightly. I didn't know what to do. At the time, I thought if people knew, I'd be convicted, lose everything. I took her to the shed. I had the lime bag, rope, tarpaulin. I put her in the drum, covered her with lime so there'd be no smell, then poured cement around the lid. The next morning, I buried the drum in the backyard, dug it deep, then leveled the soil. That evening, I wrote the letter, so everyone would believe she left. The room sank into silence. Only the sound of Grady's pen scratching quickly on the statement remained. Allison looked at the old man before her, not a monster, but someone who had chosen the wrong path to hide his mistake. 60 years, he had lived with that secret, until the end of his life, when everything seemed decayed with time. The truth rose from the ground. She asked softly, "Do you regret it?" Ray replied, his voice like a breath. Every night was a sentence. I heard her voice in the wind, in the dogs barking, all my life. Grady nodded to the recording technician. The session end buzzer sounded softly. They handed Ray the statement to read. He took the pen trembling and signed, Raymond Whitfield. Under the notes section, Allison added, "Voluntary statement, in presence of state prosecutor, fully recorded." As Ray was led out of the room, he paused at the door, turning to Allison, speaking in nearly a whisper. "You're Henson's granddaughter, right? I recognize that look. Your grandfather came here that year, looked at me just like you do now." Allison nodded slightly. He gave a faint smile. He was right. The truth always comes back. The door closed, footsteps fading down the long hall. Allison sat alone, watching the still-running recorder, its red light blinking like the slow heartbeat of a case just revived. 60 years of waiting, and finally, guilt had been named by the trembling voice of the perpetrator himself. 3 days after the interrogation, on the morning of August 19, 2005, Decatur's sky was overcast, low clouds and wind from the Sangamon River, carrying heavy dampness. A convoy of Illinois State Police vehicles left headquarters, heading to the plot that was once 47 North Jasper, the place that over 6 decades ago had been the Whitfield's home. In the lead car, Ray Whitfield, now 98, sat between two officers, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes still bright, as if awaiting a final meeting with his own past. Allison Henson rode with the convoy. She didn't take her eyes off the old man the whole way. Ray said almost nothing, just looked out the car window, where familiar fields and trees gradually appeared. When the convoy stopped at the vacant lot, now a wild grassy patch next to an unfinished construction site, he sighed softly. "Here, still the same. I thought this place was gone." The forensics and police team cordoned off the area based on his directions. A rough map was spread on the car hood. Ray used a trembling pencil to point to the west corner behind the old house foundation. "Right there," he said slowly, "next to the second maple from the fence counting in." I dug about 5 feet deep. The drum lay horizontal, lid facing the river. That spot now held only bare tree stumps and cracked cement patches. Allison signaled the technicians to scan with a metal detector. Within minutes, the device beeped faintly at exactly the position he described. Digging began layer by layer of sod, strata of old soil, color shifting from brown to gray, mixed with white lime fragments. The air thickened, silence broken only by shovels hitting earth. When the hole reached about 5 feet deep, a faint hollow metallic clang rang out, the sound of long rusted iron. A technician bent down, brushing off soil, revealing a curved brown rust streak, the remnant of a nearly decayed drum bottom. The whole team went still. Allison approached, looking into the pit. Everything matched chillingly. They didn't dig further, but used soft brushes to clean around the drum's edge. The metal had disintegrated, leaving only a faint frame, inside fragments of black tarpaulin mixed with small bone shards blended into the soil. Forensics technician Karen Doyle confirmed. Lime traces and adult human bone structure, right location, right depth. Ray Whitfield, standing a few meters away, looked down into the hole, gripping his cane tightly. He said softly, almost to himself, "I buried her with my own hands right here." Allison turned to him, nodding. "You've kept your word, now let us bring her home." Police immediately sealed the area. Every clod of soil, metal fragment, lime particle was documented and tagged. A temporary wooden sign was staked at the pit's edge, reading, "Remains confirmed. Case #1945, E. Whitfield." That afternoon, as collection wrapped up, the entire site was covered with white tarps. Wind from the river blew in, carrying the scent of damp earth mixed with chill. Allison watched the technicians load the final evidence box onto the truck. It all matched Ray's confession. The position, depth, drum orientation, even the cement layer he had once poured over it. No doubts remained. State Prosecutor Thomas Grady, present at the scene, shook Allison's hand. "This is the final piece. 60 years, and we've found where she lay." Allison nodded, her eyes fixed on the empty pit. She knew that with the remains confirmed entry signed in the afternoon log, the Eleanor Whitfield case was finally complete, legally and morally. Before leaving, Ray was allowed to sit and look at the plot one more time. 2 officers helped him closer, stopping at the pit's edge. He gazed down, his aged face sinking into the gray-silver dusk. A moment later, he spoke slowly. "I lived 60 years with this hole in my heart. Now it's open. Thank you for finding her." No one replied. Allison only bowed her head, gently placing a roadside wildflower at the pit's mouth. White-gray like the 1945 photos. As the convoy drove away, light rain fell, droplets on the fresh-dug earth, sounding like whispers, perhaps Decatur, saying goodbye to the woman it had forgotten too long. That evening, the final log was signed and sent to the prosecutor's office. Remains confirmed. Case 1945. Location and burial characteristics match suspect Ray Whitfield's confession exactly. Physical and forensic evidence confirms the Eleanor Whitfield murder case resolved. On her desk, Allison closed the file. 60 years after that July night, in 1945, the Whitfield house was gone, but its secret had finally been excavated, not just from the ground, but from the memory of an entire town. In March 2006, nearly a year after the rusted drum was unearthed from the soil, the Macon County Court officially opened the trial for the state of Illinois versus Raymond Whitfield, charged with first-degree murder of his wife Eleanor Whitfield, who disappeared in July 1945. That morning, outside the Decatur courthouse, dozens of reporters, TV vans, locals, and high school students crowded the stone steps. Many held reprinted old newspapers from the 1940s, with headlines like "Decatur Teacher's Mysterious Disappearance." 60 years later, the case returned. No longer rumor, but truth brought before justice. Inside, the atmosphere was solemnly heavy. Ray Whitfield, 99 years old, was wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair, draped in a gray sweater, his face gaunt but eyes alert. At the prosecution table, Thomas Grady and the Illinois State Cold Case team, led by Allison Henson, were ready. Evidence boxes lined the table, numbered Exhibit A, Macon Hardware Invoice, 1945, Exhibit B, Forged Letter to Book Club, Exhibit C, Remington Portable, No. 5 Typewriter, Exhibit D, Lot 45B, Drum, Exhibit E, Forensics, Report and Recorded Confession, Exhibit F, 2005 Exhumation Log. The entire chain of evidence was a picture spanning 6 decades, no longer scattered pieces, but a complete story of crime, cover-up, and justice. As Grady rose to deliver the opening statement, the courtroom hushed. His voice rang steady. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we are not just trying a man, but a lie, that has lasted 60 years. In July 1945, Eleanor Whitfield was murdered in her own home. Her killer, her husband, Raymond Whitfield, wrapped her body in tarpaulin, doused it in lime, placed it in a drum, and buried it in the backyard. He forged a letter saying she left and lived on as if nothing happened. But truth doesn't decay with time. It lay under the ground, waiting to be found. The prosecution presented each piece of evidence, starting with the Macon hardware invoice, where Ray bought lime, sisal rope, tarpaulin, and drum just 2 days before Eleanor's disappearance. The invoice, preserved by Sheriff Robert Henson in 1945, became the first link between past and present. Next, they presented the forged letter, the one Ray typed, sent to Eleanor's book club to fabricate her leaving Decatur to rest. Document, Examiner Dr. Leonard Greer was called to testify, projecting magnified photos for the jury to see the exact E and R misalignments, matching the Remington Portable No. 5, recovered from his grandson's home. Greer spoke slowly, clearly. No two Remingtons produced the same mechanical flaw. This letter was typed on that exact machine, and the only owner was Raymond Whitfield. As the prosecution played the recorded confession, the courtroom went deathly still. Ray's voice rasped evenly. "We argued, she fell, I panicked. I buried her in the backyard. I covered her with lime, wrapped in tarpaulin, then poured cement." Each word he spoke pierced the air, heavy and cold. Allison sat in the front row, eyes fixed straight ahead. She no longer saw a criminal, but an ending that her grandfather had once sought. After the confession, the prosecution presented the exhumation evidence. Photos from the 2005 dig appeared, the curved outline of the drum tarpaulin fragments, bone shards, white lime layers. Forensics technician Karen Doyle stood before the court, confirming depth of 1.5 meters, drum orientation, and lime layer matched the suspect's statement exactly. The examination report from Dr. Martin Kellogg was read to the jury. Calcium isotope analysis confirms the victim lived in Decatur, matching the 1944 dental X-rays from Dr. Charles Barnes. Teeth and X-rays match perfectly. Identity confirmed as Eleanor Whitfield. Cause of death, blunt force skull trauma. As the prosecution finished its presentation, the courtroom sank into heavy silence. The court-appointed defense attorney, a middle-aged man who looked weary, stood to counter. He relied on the last remaining argument. "Your Honor, there is no direct eyewitness to the crime, no DNA samples, no blood traces. Everything is inference based on old physical evidence." He paused, glancing at Ray, then continued, "My client was just a desperate husband at the time. Mrs. Eleanor fell and died by accident. That is not premeditated murder." But Grady rebutted immediately. If it was an accident, why did he bury the body, cover it in lime, pour cement, and forge a letter? Fear doesn't justify 60 years of lies. The acts of concealment, evidence tampering, and document forgery are those of a man who knew the guilt he committed. The trial lasted 8 days, with more than 12 witnesses summoned, including residents who lived next to the Whitfield house in 1945. Mr. Henry McAllen, now over 80, appeared in a wheelchair, his voice trembling. "That night I heard arguing, then something heavy falling. After that, a truck driving away. The next morning, their house lights were still on." That statement silenced the entire courtroom. Throughout the trial days, Ray said almost nothing. He just sat still, hands on his knees, eyes following each witness. When Allison was called to the stand, she briefly recounted the investigation process, about her grandfather's note in the old file. "If anyone finds her, start with the invoice." Grady asked her, "What made you believe this case could be solved after 60 years? Allison replied, "Because evidence doesn't die. People just forget it." The answer made many in the courtroom bow their heads. On the 8th day, the 12-person jury retired to deliberate. Outside, the tension was suffocating. Reporters waited 4 hours, whispers of predictions filling the air. Allison sat in the back row, looking down at her hands, fingers ice cold. 4 hours later, the deliberation room door opened. The jury foreman stood, holding the verdict form. "We, the jury of Macon County Court, find the defendant Raymond Whitfield guilty of first-degree murder, with irrefutable evidence." A murmur rippled through the room. Ray remained still. He showed no reaction, no bowed head. Only when the judge read the sentence, life imprisonment nominal, considering age and health, did he give a faint smile, eyes closing. No one knew if it was a smile of relief or exhaustion. Allison quietly left the room as reporters surged forward. Outside, early spring's cold wind blew across the square. She looked toward the Sangamon riverbank, where the futile 1945 search had taken place. 60 years later, everything closed right where it began. That evening, the Decatur Herald ran a headline taking up the entire front page: Illinois' longest cold case solved. Justice for Eleanor Whitfield after 60 years. Below was a black and white photo of Eleanor smiling, next to one of Allison standing before the court, her face composed. For Decatur's people, the case closed not just with a life sentence for the killer, but with a message: truth can be buried, but it never disappears. And somewhere in the wind, people still believe that on that night, on the old plot behind the Whitfield house, Eleanor's soul finally found peace. In June 2006, 3 months after the trial ended, the Illinois State Cold Case Unit released the official comprehensive report titled Whitfield Case File 1945-2006. It was a report over 400 pages thick, meticulously compiled over 8 months, synthesizing the entire progression from disappearance, investigation, exhumation, to trial. In the history of Illinois criminal investigations, no case had ever been closed after more than 6 decades, and no file had been reconstructed in such detail. On release day, the 5th-floor conference room at the state police headquarters in Springfield was packed with reporters, senior officers, forensics experts, and media representatives. In the front row, Allison Henson, the lead investigator, sat silently, a thick hardcover file in dark blue before her, stamped Illinois State Police Cold Case Division, Report Number 217 WF. The report opened with a single page in italics. For those who believe time can erase everything, this case proves the opposite. The first section listed all 73 pieces of evidence collected and reanalyzed throughout the investigation. Purchase invoice from Macon Hardware, 1945. Forged letter to the book club. Remington Portable No. 5 typewriter, serial 78264. Lot 45B drum. Sisal rope, tarpaulin, lime samples, soil samples. 1944 dental x-rays from Dr. Charles Barnes. 2005 exhumation scene photos. Recorded confession of Raymond Whitfield. Each piece of evidence included examination reports, collection dates and times, and descriptions of modern analysis methods applied, from spectroscopy, calcium isotopes, to mechanical typewriter forensics. The next section summarized 14 witness and investigator statements across 2 phases, 1945 and 2004-2005. Among them were the original statements from neighbors Henry and Martha McAllen, who heard the argument the night Eleanor disappeared, from Kelly DeLude, the hairdresser who first reported to police, along with the 2005 statement transcript from Raymond Whitfield himself, a 3-hour audio recording archived under Code Audio File 45BRW. The final section of the file was 12 original documents restored from Macon County archives, including Sheriff Robert Henson's 1945 notebook, a lost report found in an old drawer, and his note: "If anyone finds her, start with the invoice." Those pages were preserved in the department's humidity-controlled vault, regarded as testament to a previous generation of investigators who kept the flame of justice alive, even as the file gathered dust for over half a century. In the methods summary section, the cold case team stated clearly, the Whitfield case breakthrough rested on 3 main pillars: file archiving, preservation of original documents, even something as simple as a paper invoice, allowed accurate reconstruction of the event chain after 60 years, physical analysis, use of modern forensic technology, material spectroscopy, isotope studies, mechanical typewriter examination, to prove evidence origins beyond time. Intergenerational investigation. The link between two generations of investigators, Robert and Allison Henson, was the decisive factor that reopened and completed the file. On page 387, in the conclusion section, bold text took up half the page. All data evidence, statements consistent. Cause of death, blunt force skull trauma from mechanical impact. Suspect, Raymond Whitfield. Verdict, guilty. File sealed, case closed. The 15th of March 2006. The very end of the report was an addendum written by Allison, a short passage, almost a tribute to her grandfather and all who had passed through this case. We didn't solve this case just with technology, but with memory and patience. 73 pieces of evidence, 14 statements, 12 documents, each small detail a voice. Physical evidence doesn't lie. It just waits for someone who knows how to listen. That afternoon, as the press conference ended, Allison stayed in the empty room. She opened the file slowly, pausing at the black and white photo of Eleanor Whitfield, the young woman with a gentle smile. Below the photo, her grandfather's 1945 caption remained, "No body, no justice." Now, she lightly crossed it out in red pen and added, "The body has been found, and justice has been served." In the hallway outside, sunset fell on the row of cabinets holding hundreds of unsolved cases. On the third shelf, the dark blue cardboard box labeled Case File Hash 1945, 217, E. Whitfield stood neatly, sealed with a red case closed stamp. The cabinet door closing echoed softly, like a period at the end of a 60-year journey. Allison turned off the light and stepped out of the room. The long hallway, light reflecting off the walls onto a new bronze plaque, Cold Case Unit, Justice Never Forgets. She smiled faintly. Behind her, the files stood silent, but she knew, somewhere, amid the aged papers and rusted evidence, justice was still waiting for the next one who knew how to listen. A week after the official Whitfield Case File 1945-2006 report was released, newsrooms across Illinois ran the story simultaneously. On the front page of the Herald and Review, a headline took up half the page, 1945, Missing Teacher. Finally found, a faded photo from the old file. Eleanor Whitfield, in a white dress, smiling radiantly, was placed next to a photo of her new gravestone at Greenwood Cemetery, where the city had just held a reburial service for her remains. 60 years after the night she vanished, Decatur could finally say goodbye to the woman it had unwittingly forgotten. The memorial was held on a Sunday morning, under light sun, an early summer breeze rustling the maple leaves in the cemetery like whispers. Over 100 locals attended, including students whose parents had told them the missing teacher story, former neighbors, and descendants of Sheriff Robert Henson. No one spoke much. They stood silently around the small grave, with a simple stone marker engraved, Eleanor Whitfield, 1914-1945. At rest, after 60 years of waiting, an elderly woman placed a bouquet of white daisies at the foot of the grave, whispering, "We lived next to a crime for 60 years without knowing." That statement spread through the community like a wake-up bell. That night, local newspapers and radio stations devoted special programs to the case, not just recounting investigation details, but discussing how a small-town silence could bury a secret for so long. On Wand Radio, the Voices of Decatur program aired an old interview with Mr. Henry McCallan, the neighbor who heard the 1945 argument. Now 82, his voice trembled over the phone. "I always thought I misheard. If I'd reported to police sooner back then, maybe she would have been found." At the other end, the host only said, "No one can go back, but at least today, Decatur did the right thing." The Whitfield house, now just old concrete foundations after demolition, became a stop for Illinois State Police Academy students in the Cold Case Investigation and Evidence Preservation course. Each year, new investigators were brought here, retold the story of a case solved only by an invoice and persistence passed through 2 generations. At the Springfield Lecture Hall, the opening lecture projected Allison Henson's quote on screen, "Files can sit in storage for 60 years, but crimes never expire. Specialty papers called it Illinois' longest solved cold case. The State Justice Commission added it to model cases in training programs, while the Springfield Forensics Institute displayed the rusted drum and Remington typewriter as symbols of professional patience. For investigators, the Whitfield case was not just an achievement, but proof of the value of evidence preservation and the belief that justice may walk slowly, but it always arrives where it should. For Decatur's people, the case closed, but its echo lingered. Numerous articles, essays, and even a local documentary were produced, recounting the story from the town's perspective, the place that once slept beside a crime. At small coffee shops around the central square, people still mentioned the house at 47 North Jasper as a reminder sometimes the scariest thing isn't evil, but indifference. A year after the trial, Allison returned to Greenwood Cemetery, bringing a small bouquet and a copy of the final investigation report. She placed it before Eleanor's gravestone, lingering a long time. Wind gently stirred the branches overhead, sunlight filtering through the leaves like slow movement across the gray stone. In that moment, she thought of her grandfather, Robert Henson, who wrote the note. If anyone finds her, start with the invoice. 60 decades later, she had finished the story he left unfinished. That evening, in the Springfield Cold Case Unit office, Allison completed the final line in the Whitfield case summary. The section for the lead investigator's remarks. She wrote in slanted script, slowly and firmly, "Justice doesn't come quickly, but it never forgets the way back." As she set down the pen, the wall clock struck midnight. Golden light fell on the black and white photo of Eleanor hanging on the wall, her face faded in time but bright in memory. Allison gently closed the file, affixed the final case closed seal. Whitfield then stood and looked out the window at the sleeping city. Outside, wind from the Sangamon River blew in, carrying cool mist and rustling leaves. In the night silence, Decatur seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if finally freed from the secret that had weighed on it for 60 years. Somewhere in the wind, people believed that teacher Eleanor Whitfield had finally come home. In American life today, the Eleanor Whitfield story in Decatur, Illinois reminds us that justice may walk slowly but never loses its way, as long as community, family, and authorities hold on to memory and evidentiary discipline. The very everyday details saved the entire case. An invoice at Macon Hardware for lime, sisal rope, tarpaulin, a forged letter typed on a Remington Portable 5 with misaligned A and R keys. The Lot 45B drum buried in the backyard. Lime residue on the bones, and neighbor Henry McCallan's memory of the late-night argument, the truck leaving 47 North Jasper. In today's reality, that translates to 3 pieces of advice. Don't dismiss signs of domestic violence or a loved one suddenly disappearing. In the U.S., every state has a hotline. Reporting early can change the outcome. Document and preserve from emails, receipts, security footage, to texts. Because physical evidence doesn't lie, it just waits for someone who knows how to listen. It was the invoice copy Sheriff Robert Henson kept and Allison's modern forensic skills that bridged past to present. Civic responsibility, if you're the Mr. McCallan today, report it immediately. Don't let neighborhood silence shelter crime for 60 years. Finally, intergenerational persistence, from Robert to Allison, from the Piper Cub search along the Sangamon River to the Greenwood Cemetery burial, teaches us that caring for community isn't a fleeting gesture, but a long-term commitment to truth and human dignity. If you believe justice can be buried, but never lost, subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to uncover forgotten cases across America. Thank you for following the journey to reclaim the truth of Eleanor Whitfield. We'll see you in the next true crime story.